All right, I think we're ready to go. Yeah? Not quite, almost.
I'm fighting it because I'm mad.
For the sake of expediency, I will go first. So my talk today is going to be on a very peculiar place for Yiddish. And the underlying leitmotif of the talk is to convince everyone here why you should study Yiddish and why you should have your children study Yiddish. And in the end, I'll explain one very good reason why you should do it. So I'll explain, that's the punchline of this talk. So this is based upon a book I'm working on Yiddish travel narratives. And so among the narratives that I looked at were narratives to Spain. An unlikely place where you would think that people are writing about Yiddish, but actually it's quite important. So let me see if I can find the talk. I don't mean to be funny, it's just that I'm kind of pathetic. Okay. All right, so this is on, it's not just on Spain, it's also the Spanish Civil War, which was one of the most important Yiddish sites in the modern period. You probably didn't know that. I don't use PowerPoint, so.
Can I help you with this? Better to be big?
You can order one, I have no idea how to use this. I'm one of these professors who will not use PowerPoints in class. Lost it. So I opened up with, it's part of the Civil War, and nobody paid. And the nice thing about looking at the Spanish Civil War, how do we go to the next slide?
Press the,
Here?
you know what, I'll just do it for you. And you
I'm
just
not
tell me
that
when you're ready.
stupid, you just show me how to.
The arrow, forward and back.
So I would say this is supposing to give a war and everybody came. And as you know, the Spanish Civil War, it was mass influx of people who were coming to help the Republic. And probably the largest group, proportionally, were Jews. It really drew Jews from all around the world to help prop up the Republic. And of course, there's some very classic books that came out of the Spanish Civil War. If you haven't read Almost to Catalonia by George Orwell, you should. It's really one of the great books. As I often say, it's a book I wish I had written. And some of the classic photographs from the Spanish Civil War were done by this Jewish photographer named Shin. He was one of the founding members of one of the great photography groups, Magnum. Maybe you would recognize that photograph on the right. But his brother-in-law was S.L. or Shinlam Schneiderman. And Schneiderman is a very favorite writer of mine, Yiddish writer of mine, who was a very serious journalist. And he covered the Spanish Civil War and wrote this book called Krieg in Spanien, which is War in Spain. It's actually a series of accounts he wrote for Height, the very prominent Yiddish daily in Warsaw, among other publications, and then ultimately culled that material together into a book. There were other people who went to Spain, not necessarily for the Civil War. Sholem Asch, the very famous Yiddish novelist, wrote a travel book on Spain, my trip across Spain, Chaim Shoshka is one of my favorite Yiddish travel writers. Wrote a series of essays on Spain for a larger book he did on Länder und Städte, lands and cities. Schneiderman had Krieg in Spanien, and then T. Elsky had a book Auf die Fronten von Spanien, on the fronts of Spain. And I'll tell you a little bit about them in a second. Schneiderman was born in Kazimierz nad Wisła. It's a very lovely, those of you who have been to Poland, you may have gone to this. It's a very beautiful town, and it's a very, very colorful town. With a lot of lore connected to it, which I can't go into right now because I only have 20 minutes. But it was an artist colony for Polish and Yiddish writers and painters, and Sholem Asch actually spent his summers there. So Schneiderman began writing poetry in Yiddish and Polish, and then he moved to Warsaw in 1925, and he wanted to translate Polish works into Yiddish. And he studied an advanced school of journalism in Warsaw, and he became a journalist. And one of his first books of reportage was called From the Nalefky to the Eiffel Tower. I'm ready to do kind of poetic book. Had I been able to speak on this, it would fit better by other panelists do, but I can't write on. I can't. It's too poetic for me. It's not my thing. So I like things a little lower, sort of medium brown things. So he immigrated to Paris in 1933. There he comes into contact with the major European literary figures, and then he goes back to Poland in 1936 to cover the Pshittik pogrom and the after effects. And then word breaks out that the Civil War word comes that the Civil War had broken out in Spain. And he asked the various publications he worked for if he could go there to cover it. So he had multiple publications in Polish and in Yiddish in Poland that he was writing for. So actually it's one of the first assignments he did where he actually made a lot of money because he was covering this for so many different publications. He tells this anecdote that all of his correspondence always had this byline, a thing underneath, a tag underneath that said, all rights reserved. And he had various publications that stole the material and republished it, including that tagline, all rights reserved. But he also wrote for the Mexico City's Yiddish newspaper, Der Weg, which is a tiny publication. And he used that because it was on their letterhead to cross Republican lines, because Mexico was the only country in Latin America that supported the Republic. The Yiddish newspaper let it giving him his passepartout over the barricades. T. Elsky also went to Spain from Paris. He actually went for the Workers' Olympiad, which had taken place just shortly before the Civil War. And he joined the International Brigades and then wrote for the Communist Yiddish press around the world. I want to compare them to how they wrote in a moment, but I just want to say a few words about war reportage and as a subgenre of travel writing. So it's primarily about travel. So the mechanisms of travel foregranted are always trains and cars and all those kind of things that let you know you're on the road. The apparati of documentation, what we call self-reflexivity, are really highlighted, which means cameras, if they use tape recorders, or writing equipment, you're always going to see that prominently because it's just part of the way in which they let you know that they're doing serious work. And securing documents is a really important part of the narrative. Crossing borders, obviously extremely important. And of course, encountering the unfamiliar. And the sense of danger. This is always there in travel writing. And also in the case of Yiddish travel narrative, it's the presence of Jews and or Jewish language out of context, which is a standard trope defining the Jewishness of the genre. This is how you know you're in the world of Jewish travel narrative, because suddenly Jews pop up where they shouldn't be. And that's sort of like a little joke. I call it the jack-in-the-box theory of Jewish Yiddish travel narrative. Among the critical differences between travel writing and war reportage is that it is an intensification of each one of these categories. It's not just dangerous, it's very dangerous. You can really get killed. The pervasiveness of death, and also important to know that military theatricality was considered by various scholars as a necessary mask to hide the absurdity of random death that people are being turned into killers. So war correspondents play a role in this because their job is to highlight the valor of these soldiers who are dying or the great generals who are leading their troops. So they're part of this larger element of theatricality that takes place in war, which makes us all accustomed to the fact that it normalizes the war experience for readers, even for soldiers who only go into war. Now, the result of this is war correspondents generally tell us very little about battle. They generally don't go to the front. So they're recording stuff that in the war briefings that are given by the general staff. It's pretty unusual that they're at the front. There are some, but unusual. And my guy Schneiderman is typical. He was not really at the front. So few saw combat. They rely upon press conferences, and they're almost always partisan. They're supporting one side or another. Something I want to mention that is that Shalom Ash and Chaim Shosh's catalogs of Spain are rather mournful. Their take on Spain is very much like the writers who went to Poland right after World War II and write about the impact of the Holocaust on Polish Jewry. These guys write about Spain in exactly the same kind of way. The Spanish Jews are dead, they're gone, and what they're seeing is like the tragedy of Spanish Jewry. It really could be written about Poland right after the war. Elsky, however, was a communist, and that's not what he sees when he goes to Spain. And for him, the intolerance of religious intolerance will be resolved once communism takes over. So now, what's striking, and this you'll love, is that in all of them except Elsky, one common feature that they have is the description of the bullfights. So, you know, a Jew goes to Spain, and they're amazed at these kind of things. You know, and they can't help but describe it. And of course, they're describing it in Yiddish. So I ask you a question: how do you say matador in Yiddish? How do you say toreador in Yiddish? Yeah, thank you. No problem. But they also, what they see also in these for Ash and Shoshkes, what they see really are the auto de fe. They see this torture when the bulls being tortured to death, the Jews being tortured to death 500 years earlier in Spain. That's what they see, and they become very, very saddened by this. Schneiderman is a different kind of character. He goes to a bullfight, he describes in graphic detail the toreadors, the matadors, what happens to the bull. And as the bull is being tortured, there's a guy sitting next to him who looks really like someone he should know, who screams out, Oi, they helped me, die fell. They ruined the fur, the skin from me. And he reaches over to him, and he shakes his hand. It turns out he's from Warsaw also, and he's buying pelts, whatever, skins, because they're making boots, soles for boots out of it. Apparently, a very durable material. And so every time they stab the animal, he's getting screwed. So, Shannon knows about the terrible history of the locations he goes to, but his primary concern are the possibility of Jewish immigration to Spain. He sees this as a liberal country. It's a very liberal country. They're non-anti-Semitic, and he keeps asking questions about are Jews welcome here. And that's sort of the leitmotif that runs through his writing at this time. So he sees what's going on in the Civil War as a reconciliation between Spain and the Jewish people. So this is, and he writes a great deal about fighting Jews. We don't have enough time for me to go into some of the narrative, but it's a particularly powerful narrative when he describes being in Valencia, and as fascist planes are overhead, about to do a bombing raid on the city, and it's a very packed city filled with refugees, and the construction is not very good. There's no real bomb shelters, and there's an area alarm, and he goes running with the population into a basement to hide out to see if they can get some safety from it. And this goes on for 2 hours with the sirens going, and there's no bombs. So they're worried this is going to happen. Then suddenly there's a sign, an indication that the raid is over. He leaves and they go to find out what happened. The planes had turned out circled for a while and decided to take off and bomb some other place. And then he finishes, and he talks about these 2 pregnant women who were standing next to him during the raid, and the would-be raid, and how impressed he is with their bravery, how Spanish people they can withstand this kind of thing. And he's very, very, he sees him in the most heroic of terms. That's important in a moment. And he sees how disciplined they are, and he believes that Madrid will hold out against the fascists. And then the next morning, I'll just read this, that after napping, the Blue Valencia was awoken by the sound of the Marseillaise and the thundering voices of the Internationale. 2,000 volunteers from France stopped there on their way to Madrid as reinforcements to the various battalions of the international brigades. Shortly afterwards, as the transport trucks with the 2,000 volunteers left en route to Madrid, from Madrid on that same highway, there began to arrive evacuated university professors, scientists, writers, artists, and the last groups of children who were being sent to towns and cities throughout the region of Valencia. A number of trucks also brought art objects and valuable books from the National Library. Among them was the first printed copy of Don Quixote. I love this piece of writing. I mean, it's very powerful. It just evokes the tragedy of Spain at this time, and how impressed he is with them, with how they're withstanding this. So Elsky, by contrast, is less concerned about Jews. He's chiefly interested in Jewish heroism, those who are in the battle fighting, and he has whole chapters to these Jewish heroes on the battlefield and how they died heroically. What we call the heroic monumental, very typical communist way of presenting war in World War II. Schneiderman's text has no such Jewish heroes. They're heroes of a lesser kind. And they have almost a pleading quality to them. His main character in this regard is a literate but impoverished Krakow pants maker who's there to help defend the Republic. It's a rather diminished hero. And he lacked, I think, the ideological rigidity that necessitated the heroic monumental of a communist. Ruth Weiss, the literary scholar Ruth Weiss, picks up from the very pejorative type of Das kleine Menschele, the little man, underlying Mendel and Mochesforin's Jewish representations, very much part of Moskilic writings. It's very critical of Jewish characters. And she sees it as it gets transformed into the Shlemiel as a modern hero. So what was a very pejorative characterization become in modern Jewish cultural productions something rather positive and heroic in a certain way. So it's a little man sympathetically conceived and small only by sociological, not moral standards. And we're going to see in a second how this happens, gets transformed on the battlefields of Spain. So I want to finish with a favorite little anecdote, and I'll come back to what I said at the beginning about the importance of learning Yiddish. So this is Elsky's Die Fronten von Spanien, and then his narrative strangely goes completely contrary to the road monumental. And in the third chapter, titled The 12th Brigade, Elsky is in a battle zone near Madrid, and the Republican soldiers are trying to defend themselves from enemy aircraft strafing them. The car enters a narrow street, looking for the general staff, and there's no one around who understands Spanish, can you imagine? A small Hungarian volunteer explains to Elsky in broken French, this too, he can't even speak French, that except for Spanish, every other language is spoken. The headquarters has moved, and what remains is a telephone which is in the hands of 3 Jews, of course. There's something about communication and Jews which is actually really important symbolically. Anyway, a brigade of Polish volunteers has been sent to reinforce the 12th Battalion and is somehow lost. Elsky's car is carrying provisions and ammunition and tries to find them. They continue traveling through a lengthy park until reaching a lone villa where a telephone is manned by Mendel of Belleville. We ask him to make the connection so we can find out something about the missing battalion. Mendel does so right away. We stand next to him and are prepared to hear a report that Mendel asks for in Spanish or French, but instead we hear Mendel screaming into the receiver in pure Mama Russian, in Yiddish. And it says, listen good, General Lukács isn't here? I know. If not, you can count on really getting hell. Und nicht, dass du sich ausrichten nach Schwarzjord. The scene went on for a few minutes because Yeshubnik Sokol, who was at the other end of the line, berated Mendel in much the same way. And this, to imagine, they're both screaming at each other, Schwarzjord of you or Schwarzjord in Spain in the middle of a battle. And this is the moment that everything around us was infused with death. It was impossible not to laugh because of this unusual use of words that took place over a telephone at the front near Madrid between 2 Jewish workers, one from Belleville, the other from Eretz Yisrael. So I conclude with the following. My daughter Tamar is in college, she's at McGill, and I convinced her to take first semester of Yiddish, and she thought, if I take this, will I be the favorite child? I said yes. So she came home for the break, and she wasn't sure she wanted to continue. And I said, but don't you really want to be the favorite child? Okay. So I used this idea of the favorite child to get her to continue with Yiddish, but I thought that I could also use this. If you're on the battlefield, might it not come in handy one day? That's all I have to say. So thank you very much.
30 seconds to spare.
Wow. Okay. Well, you can go one more.
So should we try?
Can I?
Yes, you'll have to use the things that are plugged into his.
So thank you very much to Margot and to Vicki and for everybody else who organized this panel tonight. I'm really glad to be here in East Lansing. So thanks for having me. So I guess I'm going to start by not directly referencing the title page on the screen, but talking a little bit about the story of how I came to study Yiddish, because I think it directly leads into the topics and the themes and the particular interests that I have. So when I was an undergraduate, I was taking, like a lot of undergraduates, a Jewish American literature course and reading Philip Roth and Bernard Malman and all of the great Jewish American writers. And the person teaching the course was a man named William Melvin Kelly, who in the 1960s was a fairly prominent writer in the Black Arts movement. And he had converted to Reform Judaism and was teaching Jewish American literature at Sarah Lawrence, where I went to college. And I said to him, you know, Bernard Malman and all of these writers, I feel kind of bored. Like, I feel that kind of a lot of the themes that are being talked about, assimilation, all these kinds of themes, I want to try to read something that's going to give me a sharper view of Jewish American culture. And he looked at me and he said, why don't you read Uncle Tom's Cabin? And I said to myself, well, certainly that's not Jewish literature. It was written by a white American woman, and it was a globally popular novel. And he said, well, there it is. There's the globally popular novel. And so lo and behold, many years later, I came across the first Yiddish adaptation of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I can start by looking at this particular title page because it can tell us a lot about the ways in which the first American novel that was translated into the Yiddish language kind of manifested itself in a Jewish or an Eastern European Jewish cultural context. The first Yiddish adaptation of Uncle Tom's Cabin came out in 1868, and it was published in Lithuania, which was then in the Russian Empire. And it was a work of the popular Yiddish literature of the Haskalah. So what that meant was, rather than kind of the Moses Mendelssohn register of the Jewish Enlightenment, which was in German, and meant for an intellectual, mostly Hebraist elite, these Maskilic works were geared towards the common people, and they emerged later. So not so much in the 1780s and the 1790s or even 1800, but this in 1868, before the onset of the pogroms in 1880, and still kind of in the time of the Jewish Enlightenment. So what we see here from this title page are a few very interesting things. The first thing is that he changes the title of Uncle Tom's Cabin to something a lot more direct, slavery. And then he calls it Oder. He's using a Deutschwärisch, a Germanized Yiddish. He calls it Die Leibeigenschaft, which is serfdom from the German. And then he gives you the Polish translation of serfdom in the parentheses next to Leibeigenschaft. So immediately you realize as an Eastern European Jewish reader that he's translating American slavery for his Eastern European readership. Oops. Okay. And so then you have the kind of traditional Maskillic introduction to the book, and he shares with us some very interesting details and gives us a clue, the first clue, that he's not giving us a direct translation of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but actually a Jewish adaptation of the novel. So what he does is, he says this is a true and wondrous tale or history or story that happened in America about 20 years earlier to a Negro, he calls it a nigger, or Maureen, which is a Moor, Uncle Tom, and you can see Uncle Tom in parentheses there. He spells it as one word. He says he was a slave in America by a Jewish planter named Avraham Shelby.
Oh.
So he changes Arthur Shelby of Stowe's original to Avraham Shelby. And then from there, we learn that this novel has appeared in all languages and now comes down to us in a beautiful Jewish German, Yiddish, Deutsch, and that it begins with a kind of involved introduction in which he introduces the story to his readership. This was the kind of cornerstone of my dissertation. What I was interested in was, first of all, looking at the influence of American culture, United States culture, or the culture of the Atlantic world on Eastern European Jewry before the mass migrations of Eastern European Jews to the United States. So the first question was really, instead of looking at the westward movement or the de-Europeanization of Eastern European Jews, looking actually at the exposure that Eastern European Jews had previous to their emigration to American culture. Now this brought up a lot of different questions about his perceptions of American slavery, and it brought up a lot of different questions about how exactly he's understanding American racism. First of all, I think when I teach this to students, often what they'll say to me is, you know, I really thought that when he was going to translate this novel, that he would make the slaves, the enslaved people of African descent, the Jews. And who would be the slave owners? Well, they would be the Christians or the Gentiles who oppress the Jews. The reality was, for this particular translator, and he was a staggeringly popular writer who wrote hundreds of storybooks for a popular readership, he saw things a little differently. And that was one of the first striking things about this translation. Another striking thing about this translation is that it comes out in the story that he is starting to introduce to Eastern European Jewish readers the possibility of emigration to the United States. And one of the ways that he justifies or explains the advantageousness of Jewish emigration to the United States is by trying to argue to his readers that Jews, at least if they're in touch with their authentic tradition, are not abolitionists, are not against slavery, but are actually practitioners of a more humane form of slavery. So it's very important, I think, not to read our own experiences or our own perceptions of our own Americanness back into this novel, but really try to think about his own perspective. That's one of the most important things about this adaptation, is that Avraham Shelby becomes what Stowe wished Arthur Shelby would be, which is not somebody who is just a victim of his times, it's just how he thought, but rather is proactively kind of confronting the practice of slavery. And in contrast to Stowe's original, it's not an abolitionist text, but an ameliorationist text. He's arguing in the novel for the gradual emancipation of American slaves. Now this relates, of course, to the fact that he's likening American slavery to Russian serfdom. Now, he believes in his particular time, or at least he makes us believe, that he sees the Russian abolition of serfdom some years before as being much better implemented than the American version of emancipation. And because the Tsar sort of gradually emancipated the serfs, he's trying to tell us that the Russian method of liberating bonded people is superior to the American one. And thus, Jewish immigration will bring this kind of light, will bring this kind of political consciousness, this kind of humanitarianism, you could say, to American shores. One of the most fascinating aspects of this adaptation is its ending. Does anybody know in Uncle Tom's Cabin what happens to Uncle Tom at the end of the novel? He's martyred. He dies in a Christ-like, you could say, in a Christ-like fashion. And Stowe was deeply Christian, as were many abolitionists at that time. Instead, obviously, in terms of Jewish translation and adaptation, a Christ-like ending would not be appropriate for an Eastern European Jewish readership. So what does he do with Uncle Tom? They flee to Canada, they convert to Judaism, and live in an autonomous Jewish settlement or colony that is happily ever after. Right. So it sounds better than to us, maybe it sounds better than the martyrdom scenario. But that in and of itself, I think presents very interesting ethical questions, political questions about how Jews during the Haskalah were starting to conceptualize their difference from others, from new peoples that they were coming in contact with, or that they would come in contact with 20 years later. That's about all I have to say about this, but I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. The Uncle Tom's Cabin in Yiddish, and you can read a translation of the introduction on Ingeved, which is a great journal of Yiddish studies. I did a translation of the introduction, and you can really read in his introduction how invested he was in understanding American history and in understanding American culture, and that before he translated Uncle Tom's Cabin, he was familiar with the rudimentary structure of American settlement. And I know Dove Bear's referenced this before in Ann Arbor. There are certain novels that are floating around Jewish Eastern Europe at this time, like Robinson Crusoe, Joachim Kampa's The Discovery of America. There are very popular, mostly European works about American culture, American history, and American society that are available to a certain elite of Eastern European Jewish intellectuals. Uncle Tom's Cabin was one of the first attempts to translate that higher register of familiarity with American culture to a popular readership. And you see it as history goes on. You see, for example, like David Ben-Gurion, when he's interviewed, he mentions the impact that Uncle Tom's Cabin, maybe not necessarily in Yiddish, but he mentions the impact that Uncle Tom's Cabin had on his thinking, whatever that thinking was, he doesn't specify. But what you realize is that this book was very, very fundamental in the formation of all European consciousness, but was also important in the formation of American, or of Jewish Eastern European people who eventually often come to the United States. When I finished that half of my dissertation on Uncle Tom's Cabin in Yiddish, I decided to look at a similar discourse, the discourse of racial politics and racial difference, in a Jewish community that developed after the Haskalah in southern Africa. Now, many of Isaac Mayer Dick, who translated this Uncle Tom's Cabin in Yiddish, was from Lithuania. He was from the historic Lithuania. And the South African Jewish community, which develops after 1880 in the same waves of emigration that bring Jews to the United States, the South African Jewish community derives mostly from Lithuania. So I said, using that historical sort of bridge between Eastern Europe and Southern Africa, let's look at the ways in which Yiddish writers, Yiddish modernist writers at this point, basically, from 1900 to say 1950, how did Yiddish modernists and Yiddish writers in Southern Africa understand the politics of imperial subjectivity? How did they understand their place in a part of the British Empire that on one hand was conceptualizing itself against Dutch settlers, the Afrikaners, or the Boers as we know today, and as against the masses, the large, most vast majority of the population in Southern Africa, which were African people. How did they understand the politics of being an immigrant to South Africa? So I'm going to take a look at just one political cartoon. This is a political cartoon from, I think it's from the 1930s, from a Yiddish newspaper called Der Afrikaner, which is not Afrikaner in the Boer sense, but just means the African. So this is a Yiddish paper called The African, and this is one particular political cartoon, and with a caption that is very difficult, I think, to translate. Does anybody want to take a stab at it? Do it there. Do you have a translation of it? Gegenseitigen Überraschung.
One side surprised.
One side surprised?
Both sides.
Both sides are surprised. Correct. So this cartoon has always baffled me, but what I realized is that there's a long genealogy of these images of a black and white person sort of symmetrically placed against each other to somehow communicate the colonial encounter, you could say, or the experience of a European in Africa. And this, I think, focuses on fashion, I suppose, in the sense that someone on the right, who's presumably a Jewish woman, is sporting the latest European fashions here in Africa, and she notices that the person to her left is sporting a hat that, for all intents and purposes, is being constructed in this scheme as a native, as an indigenous person, as a so-called, in this particular cultural context, something that's associated with primitivism or a kind of inferiority in that context. And these kinds of cartoons, I think, are really strewn through the South African Yiddish press. All kinds of short little quips about the Jewish experience in a place that really was, in many ways, unlike anywhere else that Jewish immigrants had emigrated to. Both sides are surprised. I think that I could, I think that's a pretty apt translation, but I'm interested in hearing more from others. So I wrote a chapter on South African Yiddish modernism, and what my basic argument was, or what I was trying to sort of understand, was what kind of dialogue, what kind of interest did Yiddish writers have in the racial politics of the time. And there's quite actually in the Yiddish literature quite a bit of hostility towards British imperial culture, and an identification with the culture of the Dutch settlers. And you ask why this is in the interwar period, and in the interwar period, the Dutch settlers were in many ways constructing themselves as new Jews. And one of the ways that South African Eastern European Jews at this time fit themselves into South Africa was by expressing a kinship with the Afrikaners. Not in the sense of identifying so stridently with what we understand to be their racism, but actually with an identification with their biblical lifestyle, their desire to protect their traditions, their hostility to British imperial culture and fashion and all these kinds of things. And I think in a way this cartoon does give us a sense of how a woman who identifies with the latest, a Jewish woman who identifies with the latest European fashions is being mocked. This is a constant theme of Jews identifying with British culture, and the Yiddish press lambasting them for that identification. South African Yiddish literature is a vast bibliography. There are hundreds of books that emerged from 1900 to 1950 and even thereafter. Most of them are in conversation with great works of Yiddish literature and a desire to create a kind of indigenous Jewish culture in South Africa, in a way contrasting themselves, but also finding commonalities with the other groups in that particular imperial space. And then I'll just say a few words about what my current project is at the Frankel Center. And right now I'm working on, and this is not in Yiddish, the Yiddish translators of the Harlem Renaissance poets. So I went from Eastern Europe to Southern Africa, and now I'm working on the United States. And the idea is to write a book about Eastern European Jews in the Atlantic world, understanding engagements with racial politics, not in a United States-centric way, but in the sense of a global circulation. So in 1936 and 1935, a massive amount of Harlem Renaissance poetry was translated into Yiddish, mostly in 3 places. This is the Russian edition of African American poetry in translation. It was written by a guy named Robert Magadoff. Robert Magadoff published in 1936, before the Russian edition came out, a vast Yiddish edition of, a vast Yiddish edition of the Harlem Renaissance poets with over 140 pages of poetry. This is one example of these translations. They often came with illustrations. The translations are fascinating because I'm sure everyone here is familiar with works like Porgy and Bess, the jazz singer, all of which engage with the African American subject and with Jews trying on or impersonating an African American subjectivity. With the translations, my argument is that the translations must be distinguished from things like Porgy and Bess and the jazz singer, because the work of translation doesn't assume that you can inhabit the full subjectivity of the source, but is actually a negotiation between whatever the original is and the language to which it's being translated and the cultural demands and the constraints on the language. So as I'm working on these Yiddish translations of Harlem Renaissance poets, what I'm realizing is that a lot of the Yiddish poets and Yiddish intellectuals who engaged with black poetry in the early 20th century were not so much interested in racial identity or inhabiting the subjectivity of a black person, but were actually quite interested in African American religion, and in particularly the attention that the Harlem Renaissance poets paid to the loss of faith. You know, one of the ways that the Harlem Renaissance has been read is as not necessarily a religious poetry, but a poetry about religion and about the development of African American religion over time and the ways in which that religious tradition gave the structure and the content and the form to a modern black poetry. And what I'm arguing in this work is that Jewish intellectuals, Yiddish writers, were actually quite inspired and quite interested in this loss of faith, because it was a different kind of religious expression that they had been familiar with previously, and it appeared to be a form of Christianity, but a form of Christianity that really was set apart aesthetically and in sensibility from the European Christianity and the tropes of European Christianity that they were familiar with. So that's where I'm at with that project. But what's amazing is that not many people really write about these translations, but we have like almost all of Elaine Locke's The New Negro Anthology in Yiddish. They were published in book form, they were published in Yiddish periodicals, there are critical essays about Langston Hughes, and they were not only published in New York, they were published in Warsaw, they were published in Bucharest, they were published in Moscow. Part of it was an interest in the folk, in the idea of a folk culture evolving from a religious foundation into a modern secular cultural nationalism. But at the same time, I think a lot of Yiddish poets who were themselves the product, many of them were the product of religious Jewish upbringings, were fascinated by how James Weldon Johnson, for example, could write sermons in verse. The kind of idea of the loss of faith, I think, is really central to engaging the interface of Jewish and Black culture at this time. So thank you very much.
Okay.
There's a small delay.
Okay. Good. Okay, dear friends, first of all, thank you very much for the good people who brought us here. And of course, it was Margaret's initiative, first and foremost. And thank you very much for you to come to brave this weather. I hope I could reciprocate it one day. Okay, my topic connects to everything that was said today. And there is one common feature, characteristic for all our talks. We all like title pages. We keep showing them all the time. And they're fascinating. And now, thanks to the internet, we can get color copies as well. So my topic is poetry and Yiddish. Poetry looms large in Yiddish, not only because Yiddish poetry is very refined and highly developed, but also because being able to create poetry, just poetry, not necessarily great poetry, but real poetry, is a prerogative of high-power languages, of languages with literature. It's not the poetic works that we know from starting 14th century in Old Yiddish or pre-modern Yiddish, or even works that Margot worked with a little bit later, which may have their own poetic value. It's from the period when Yiddish was relegated to a status of jargon, as Margot said, right? It was seen as a jargon, as a corrupt German, and this is by and large as a result of enlightenment, of Jewish enlightenment, Haskalah or Haskol in Eastern Europe. And Yiddish had to put up a struggle in a way to be recognized, not that it knew that it has to, but we were lucky. We had a significant plurality of native Yiddish speakers in Eastern Europe, and that explains a lot. Because what happened to modern Yiddish culture that appeared despite all odds. I mean, really, everything was against it. So I'll deal only with poetry. And modern poetry develops much later than drama, than prose, but it has its own beginnings. And from the late 18th and early 19th century, we have, or maybe even earlier, we have, of course, the popular wedding entertainers, the so-called batchonim, many of whom spoke in rhyme. Some of them were creating new rhymes, some of them were skillfully using already existing rhymes and reconfiguring them. So that's one strain. The other strain is what we know from largely only 19th century, are the so-called Yiddish folk songs. And Yiddish, modern Yiddish is quite well known for its folk songs, which for the first time collected in a serious way in 1901. Not collected, but printed. There was some printing done in 1880s of the 19th century also. Now, when we speak about Volkslieder, and you have here this particular title page, Yiddish Melodien oder Volkslieder, they're written by a person who is known to very few even Yiddishists, who is in a way the first person to consciously use syllabotonic system of poetry, which is very Russian, very Slavic, very Russian. And his name was Rashi Katzenellenbogen. It's It's a mouthful to say. And he publishes Yiddish Melody. It's not the first one. This is 1887. We have earlier books by other people. There's also Michael Gordon. They all call it Volkslieder because those are poems, songs that they write for the people, for the folk. So that's one meaning of the word folk song. It's songs for the folk. But we also have folk songs created by the people. Okay? In 1889, a person by the name of, where is he? Yud Lerner. I had him. Just a second. Lerner. In the Thick Journal, which is the second major journal that started to appear in 1888, we had one in Kiev, this one appeared in Warsaw, and the one in Kiev was edited by Shalom Aleichem, the author of the book which became Fiddler on the Roof. Okay, this is Shalom Aleichem's claim to fame. And this person, Yudit Lerner, who was more or less a forgotten person, a very talented writer in 3 languages, Hebrew, Russian, and Yiddish, and a great champion of the Yiddish language and Yiddish theater. He causes his wife to write Yiddish plays for the theater in Odessa. Right? So his wife is one of the earlier female writers in modern Yiddish. Then maybe as a revenge, she convinces him at some stage in their life to convert to Christianity. But that's an aside. So what does he do? He publishes a paper called the Yiddish Muse, the Yiddish Jewish Muse, where he claims that no matter what people who hate the jargon say, they are wrong. Yiddish can produce poetry. But it doesn't have the poetry yet. So what does it do? He said, I will show you by using the true, the genuine Yiddish folk poetry, folk songs. I will show you that it already has all the attributes and all the wherewithal of creating modern poetry. It has humor, it has irony, it has the possibility of seeing things from outside. It has certain modes of sentimentality that can be, that in the best examples of Yiddish folk song are very skillfully constructed and so forth. So he writes this huge paper trying to show that Yiddish is salonfähig enough to create poetry. Now, back to PDF. In 1911, and this is, by the way, Yiddish Volkslieder, 1901, those are some of the best Yiddish songs built as folk songs, but written by a known author. His name was Mark Warshawski. He was discovered or made popular or famous by none other than Shalom Aleichem, that I mentioned already. And you may have heard many of his songs. For example, auf dem Pripyatschik brennt der Feuer und in den Stub ist heiß. Und der Rebbe lernt kleine Kinder the Malur base. Okay. The tune is somewhat different. Many of his tunes are actually not very Yiddish or Jewish Ashkenazi, but they're still considered to be folk songs. Okay. Ostensibly the first modern anthology of Yiddish poetry, what was then contemporary Yiddish poetry, because there were writers throughout the 19th century, but somebody had to gather them, appeared in 1911. I believe in Odessa too. No, Warsaw. And what was it called? It was called the Yiddish Muse. That's why I started with, well, that's one part of the reason why I started with Lerner, that's in the beginning. So he gave the title, right? The Yiddish Muse. And the first, I don't remember, 2 or 3 sections, because it's chronological. But let's say the first 2 sections are the folk songs. Still uses the folk songs. and then there are real authors, named authors. Okay? Paradoxically, it ends with a quite modernist, in a way, poem by a certain Lamed Shapira, who later on became a great prose writer in Yiddish literature. Okay, we said Yiddish poetry, modernist poetry is very recent. But with rise of nationalism, with rise of Yiddishism in New York, 1917. Have you seen the film 1917? Slightly different topic, but the same year. It's a great film, I saw it twice. But anyway, off topic. 1917, 2 volumes, and those are large volumes, 400 pages each, at least, are published, and the title is 500 Jahre Jiddische Poesie, 500 years of Yiddish poetry. And it finds them. This is from the, and we knew much less then about pre-modern period, literary output, but knew enough. And the person who actually, who supervised the work, the collection and supplied the glossary and some other things, some explanation, was introduction, was none other than Ber Borochov, the creator of Polentzian, what is Polentzian in English? Labor Zionist movement, who was also the founding father of modern Yiddish scholarship or philology, right? And then he went to Russia and luckily died before the Bolshevik Revolution. Also, all 1917. So you see, this is about reclaiming history. This is a typical nationalistic mood, reclaiming history, or reimagining. So all this is just prehistory, barely beginning of the modernity. We continue. Now, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, you have a new generation coming to fore. You also have some cataclysms. I just mentioned the Bolshevik Revolution, and then the way it continued was, of course, the Civil War in Russia, with great upheavals and cataclysms, and of course pogroms, and many people, among them many Jews, were killed. And we have, and in 1919, it's probably the last year of the atrocities, right? 1919 is when the war, I think, ended. Being one of the bloodiest years in the history of Russia, southern Russia, or Ukraine, we have 3 great modern Yiddish poets publishing their first collections, right? Those are Peretz Markish, David Hofstein, and Leib Witkov. The fact that you have never heard these names does not mean that they were not great poets, right? And perhaps, I'm still hopeful, maybe you have heard the names. Now, it was an explosion of Yiddish poetic creativity, because the same year, 2 other great modern poets published their first books of poetry in New York. One is Hay Leivik, whose real name was Leivik Halper. But the moment he heard that there is another poet who's called Moshe Leib Halpern, he said, I cannot continue as Leivik Halpern, I'll be Hay Leivik. And Moshe Leib Halpern, who publishes in New York in 1919 an amazing book of poems in New York, called In New York. Okay. Now what you see here on top, those are the 3 works which are written about the Civil War and the Jewish massacres in Ukraine, right? It's actually very chronological. 1921, Peretz Markish, the Kupe, the pile of bodies. 1922 is David Hofstein, in my opinion, probably the greatest lyric poet. Troyer, or Tristier, or Sorrow, Mourn, and Kvitkos, which is simply called 1919, 1923, published in Berlin. So all 5 poets each one of them is very different. Each one of them is a giant of modern poetry. Halpern and Markish are probably considered to be the greatest modernists, but as modernists, not only modernists, as modernists. But the first three collections by Knitko himself are probably even more avant-garde than some of the work by, or much of the work by Moshe Halpern or Markish. Okay, now just to sum up, because my topic is not Yiddish poetry at large, my topic is really contemporary Yiddish poetry that nobody heard about. That's why we have something new to hear. Just to sum up the 20th century, to put everything. I brought you an example of a poem by great Yiddish poet who was extremely popular, was very popular, still is very popular, and many Yiddish poets were, I knew quite a few, I'm talking about older generation, and some, or very few, are still around, or are somewhat jealous and envious of his popularity, but he is a great poet. So let us hear him reading one of his poems, a very famous poem, but widely famous in very narrow circles. Here you have a translation. Can you read it? Mm-hmm. Is there anyone who can read the English out loud, kind of a nice way for our benefit, especially for people who are far back? Can anyone read? No?
Or one of you.
For years I wallowed. No?
For years I wallowed about in the world. Now I'm going home to wallow there, with a pair of shoes and a shirt on my back, and the stick in my hand that goes with me everywhere. I'll not kiss your dust, as that great poet did, though my heart, like his, is filled with song and beauty. How can I kiss your dust? I am your dust. And how, I ask you, can I kiss myself? Still dressed in my shabby clothes, I'll stand and gape at the blue kinneret, like a roving prince who has found his bloom. Oh, blue was in his dream when he first started. I'll not kiss your blue. I'll merely stand silent as a Shemoneh, prayer myself. How can I kiss your blue? I am your blue. And how, I ask you, can I kiss myself? Musing, I'll stand before your great desert and hear the camels' ancient tread as they sway with trade and Torah on their humps. I'll hear the age-old hovering wander song that trembles over glowing sand and dies, and then recalls itself and does not disappear. I'll not kiss your sand. No, and 10 times no. How can I kiss your sand? I am your sand. And how, I ask you, can I kiss myself?
Wow, what a beautiful reading.
Thank you.
Congenial to the translation, which is almost congenial to the original. Nothing is like the original.
Let's hear it.
Okay, I think we can listen to it. It's really not very long, but you'll hear the voice of the poet himself. We don't have sound yet.
Kuschen dein Brot, was stammer soll,
Okay, I must tell you, this is an incredibly tough act to follow. Basically impossible. But what I am busy with, not far from here at Ann Arbor, this year's group that works on Yiddish matters, all things Yiddish, is something which is called contemporary Yiddish poetry. If you Google it, you'll find it's not so easy to understand what it is. It's certainly not known to better part of 99.99% of humanity. But as a phenomenon, it does exist, and that means people who write Yiddish poetry today, and I'm preparing a very small, not even selection, because I actually invited people to send in their works, not more than 2 or 3 poems, which will be bilingual, with hopefully with introduction if I ever write it, probably in both languages, and it will be bilingual to be also in English. So there is some activity in this field. First of all, you see this is a collection that was published 2 years ago. We got a prize in Montreal, the Free Public Library. It's another very imposing, it's not like 500 years of Yiddish poetry. It's barely, not even 200 pages, 160, 170 pages. And it's, I think, 19 people selected. Those are not all people that write Yiddish. I'll come to it in a second. So you can pass it around and see it. It's entirely in Yiddish, right? There is another collection I'm finishing almost in a second. Just a second. Well, anyway, you can come later and see there are some other books that I brought. And here is a journal which is a quarterly that started to appear. This issue dedicated entirely to poetry started to appear a year ago. We are now in the 2nd year of this quarterly. We hope it will continue. In Yiddish, you never know when a periodical will continue, whether the periodical will continue or not. Longevity is not something to be very good at. So just to finish, I would like to address the question, who writes Yiddish poetry today? Moreover, why write poetry in Yiddish? This is a question I don't have any answer for a collective. I know why I write Yiddish poetry, because I can't write it in any other language. I'm fairly, I'm sorry I have to talk about myself, but I'm talking out of direct experience, and something that I'm busy with more or less most of the day, every day, right? Whether conscious or unconsciously. I'm quite fluent in 3 other languages, and in some cases even better read, even though I'm professor of Yiddish literature, in other languages, some of the other languages. But I cannot express myself poetically the way I can express myself in English. So that's the reality. So there are already a few generations, right? There are people like me, and we used to be young 20, 30 years ago, right? It's true, we were young. When I was 30 something, when I started very late, at the age of 37. I didn't write poetry. When I started, we were considered to be young. And not only we, anyone who was born after the war. So anyone who was born 1945, after 9th of May, was part of the younger generation. Right? So there are people older who were born, there's even one who was born 1938, had the audacity, so Keiko doesn't fit the program, but I personally accept him. Not an easy character, but a very talented poet. And all others born between 46 and I think the youngest is 1981, who was a Polish professor of Jewish studies, Judaic studies, totally fluent in Yiddish and in Hebrew, and was not Jewish, he was Polish. Yeah. And a collection of his poems were published, I think, a year ago, which looks approximately like this, maybe a little bit smaller, but this is the series that they produced in Tel Aviv. Okay, so who are the people? I don't have full answers. And then we have people that started writing people started writing during the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Union, in the West, all kinds of leadership from Judentum circles. And then all of a sudden younger people started coming. So it's the beginning of the century. Okay. So there are different groups, and the growing group is of course the non-native Yiddish speakers, people who did not grow up in Yiddish. Obviously, Marek Krzyzewski didn't grow up in Yiddish. In fact, when we met for the first time in Jerusalem 5 or 6 years ago, we spent something like 15 minutes was telling me his family history. So I would be absolutely certain that he had no Yiddish in his background, right? And he conveyed his family history in a beautiful English. Okay, so this is a wrong browser, by the way. And I'm really finishing. I'm sorry about this. This is a failed attempt to create a website for modernist poetry. It features words of, no, this is the, it features words of these people, which is what, I forgot, I counted them, but 13? Yeah, okay. But I made an effort to collect those who published only some stuff and didn't have representation then. So I tried whoever has something that can be put on the internet or is already on the internet, I mentioned here, but I'm sure I didn't find everyone. By the way, one of them is Evgeny Kissin. Have you heard the name Evgeny Kissin? One of the greatest contemporary pianists. Where is it? That's him, that's his Yiddish website, but you obviously want his English website. Evgeny Igorevich Kissin. Right? He lives in New York. He's rather young, he was born 1971. Well, not so young, but younger. Okay. Since we are on this page that nobody ever visits, I'll just show you here is a sample of my friend, and in my opinion, the best poet of my generation. My generation consists of only 2 people who were born the same year, 1958, same place, Moscow, and he's the best. There's no doubt in my mind. He also started much earlier. Well, just to hear a little bit, he did this. I recorded some poems that he read. Come on, start reading. By the way, it's Ravka.
Is enter to alone.
Okay, one more.
Die Liebe ist es, die Liebe. Steckig Blut von Makkabäer, Anis, was es ähnlich auf sehr großen Okre, etwas, was seine Reiche ähnlich auf Reich von Bittergroß, etwas, was es ähnlich auf triebenem Weiß und auf Darnhober, und etwas, was es auf gar nicht ähnlich. Ich hab euch lieb, wie ein trickener Sosne Sug, was es auf euch gefallen, wie ein Stechelchaser, was schorchet und sopet in euer wilder Grosenisch, wie die Sonne, was vergeht, gedei aufstehen auf morgen, die eine wie ich.
Okay, and just almost finishing. Okay, I can finish with the song. Although I wanted to put Heike Brodius poem. I mean, I don't want to be accused of not showing female perspective. But instead, okay, I'll play you a song on the words of certain Boris Karloff, a very old poet, but it's not written as a poet, as a song, but it's not Yiddish, but it's based on Yiddish poet, sang by Larissa Pivatsky.
It's 8:45. Anybody who, wasn't planning to stay for a million years can certainly leave now, but anybody, I think, is it okay to ask you some questions since we've already made it all the way here? So anybody who wants to ask questions. Yeah.
I'm curious. So Yiddish, when it was a jargon, when it was obviously many jargons being spread over a wide territory with a lot of different surrounding cultures, whose Yiddish became the literary Yiddish, if that's the case?
They were not jargons, they were dialects.
Yeah, right.
Okay? And Yiddish dialects, East European Yiddish dialects, are probably also with relation to Western Yiddish, one of the most amazing examples of clear correspondences between dialects. Because the division is not according to different fiefdoms like in Germany, right? Or, but really areas that were, that was, the division was, well, the first was division between North and South. Northeast and southwest. Southwest is Poland, basically great, and northeast is Dania, Belarus. And then you have also Ukraine, which is kind of a transitional position. So the correspondence between Kum and Kim and Zog and Kum are extremely neat. I mean, there are areas on the border which are combination, but on the whole it's extremely neat. And all it means that, well, what does it mean? It means that there was a local dialect, but people could understand, with minimum of effort. They knew the correspondence because the sound change was across the board. If O became U, then U became E, and it was consistent, right? And it was maintained. In fact, for the theater, it was not the northern dialect. It was Volhynian, which is closer, kind of between Polish and Lithuanian. But it uses E, Kimen and Sudan.
So you know how linguists define language versus dialect?
It's a dialect of a flag.
A language is a dialect with an A.
And a noun.
Okay.
Well, they don't necessarily need
Same
an
thing.
But the point is that all languages are formed on dialects, and all still have dialects within them. And you have constant evolution within language through the dialect. Yiddish is no different, as I say, Yiddish is no different than any other language, only more so.
But your question is which became standard?
Yeah, that's really the
And
question.
as you say, it's the same thing for any language, that it evolves in the course of time through the intervention of cultural aficionados. So we can't look at the emergence of language, official language, without looking at how literati developed it into a higher language. And you have to say the same for German.
In other words, we just heard verbal Chelino reading 2 points. It's a good thing we 2 points. One was more conventional with right and so forth. The other one was free speech, free written. More than 90% of what I write is in rhyme and meter. Right? So the question is, how do I rhyme? Right? And I think that the default for me is the standard, which is the closest to the thing. It's not identical to the thing. Yeah. But I do use dialectal rhymes when I need them. Usually not because I need them for a rhyme, but because I want to use a dialectal form. Yeah. So that's a very limited answer.
Go ahead.
Is there a parallel with Ladino culture through the literature, any kind of parallels there?
I'm probably, well, maybe you know about it. I'm certainly the wrong person to ask about Ladino. I don't know.
I can tell you that I had the experience this Yom Kippur to be in Istanbul, at a synagogue, and the entire service was in Hebrew. And except for one point in the service where they auctioned off the aliyahs. In what language did they auction off? Ladino. So I turned to someone in the synagogue and I said, why are you using Ladino? He said, tradition. So the difference is Ladino does not have as developed a literature as Yiddish does.
Alliance Israeli it introduced an amazing change, which was very detrimental for Ladino, or to that much. They switched to using Latin characters, and they also made it more French, not even Spanish, but it's more French. So that was one of the problems. And there is certainly folklore, there's some literature as well, and literature, but it never came to a point that would equal or come close to what Yiddish achieved, as far as I know. But certainly we should ask someone who really knows it.
How much contact or interrelationships do you have with, let's say, YIVO on the one hand and the National Yiddish Book Center on the other, or both, or neither? How influential?
Me?
I mean, I would say that,
We met at the National Yiddish Book Center originally.
Yeah.
I would say I've had access to both institutions, I don't know, equally, but in equal measure, I feel that both have contributed to my ability to access Yiddish texts. They both are very strong in different ways. The Yiddish Book Center has archived thousands of Yiddish books that I can just pull off as PDFs off the internet, which has been not available to any previous generations. YIVO has archival riches that nowhere else has. Like, for example, Uncle Tom's Cabin in Yiddish, they have 3 legitimate editions and 4 pirated editions. And no one else has that except, I think, for a couple in the National Library of Israel.
While we're on the Uncle Tom thing, the Vilna Frontis piece, what is the word after B? Very long.
Sklaverei, slavery.
Oh,
Yeah.
say it again.
Sklaverei.
Okay.
It's the same root as slave,
Yeah.
sklavus, the Latin
I
sklavus.
had no idea.
But you mentioned also the National Library in Jerusalem. There's a tremendous collection of books and microfilms, and historic Yiddish newspapers on microfilms, increasingly being digitized by them. So things that used to be a real pain to locate not that many years ago, you can now get just by clicking on the internet. So it's an amazing contribution to contemporary Jewish Yiddish scholarship.
Just a question, maybe ties Jack and Eli together. This thing about the martyrdom, the ending of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and he changed it to the Canada ending. But shouldn't there be a possibility of a martyrdom in a Yiddish aesthetic? Or I just had a class with students and we were talking about, is there martyrdom in ancient Judaism? When is there martyrdom? And Pharaoh doesn't have guys saying, slaves, I'm going to kill myself.
Right.
And so why did he change it, and did he have available a Yiddish martyrdom type?
Yeah, I think that he constructed Uncle Tom as a non-Jew throughout the entire novel. So if he was to be martyred at the end, he would have had to be Jewish previous to his martyrdom. And so to turn him into a Jew was the ultimate. It also, makes a missionary narrative of a Jewish text where this character becomes Jewish. That I think goes back in a long tradition of like the Ger Toshav, or a non-Jew that throws their lot in with the Jewish people. I think that had a Polish Jewish tradition of the Ger Tzedek. I think that was kind of a circulating idea of this non-Jew that identifies with the Jews. The martyrdom thing was really because I think he knew in the original that it was a Jesus-like story, and so he avoided it entirely.
Who published those early 20th century poems, books, and who distributed them? And how far was the distribution?
Right. I showed the book in New York, right, by Alton. This is the one we want, the title. It is probably the only, as far as I know, the only collection of poetry which was a bestseller. It had at least, I wrote about it, I don't remember, 3 or 4 editions and many reprints.
But is this something
It was
like
published
somebody's
in Warsaw
backyard, or-
and in New York. No, they were
Okay.
No, they were publishing it. Actually, well, with poetry is a problem because you don't get back the money, or may barely get back the money that you put into printing and publishing. But
Not that you would know from
the
personal experience.
book printing in New York, as well as in Warsaw, was an economical thing. I mean, there were buyers. It's not. Yeah, the problem was with avant-garde and modernist literature and poetry, right? And they're complaining about it already in the 30s and 40s in America. But there was actually, I mean, in many cases it was profitable. Isaac Mayer Dick was so prolific precisely because it was profitable to sell his books, and he had a contract that was paid a weekly or monthly, whatever, fee for a certain amount of books that he would furnish. He would steal from other books, or worked, or slave. He probably published the very first edition of the Tales of the Stupid People from the town of Ches, which is Helm, apparently, right? Helmite. And he was extremely prolific. And there is a dissertation about his productivity, his work, by Davidrovskis from 1972, I believe, which is a very solid, very good dissertation.
Guys, thank you so much. And thank you all for coming out.
We did it by now.